Jacob, you said there's good and bad creation science. Can you clarify what that means, what the bad is? Do you believe the universe and the earth is billions of years old? B with the billion with the B.
Oh, okay. So this is quite a question. I have answered it before in different ways. What is the difference between good and bad creation science? Good creation science is both good theology and good science. It must be good theologically and good scientifically. It must be both. A real creationist is either a theologically and doctrinally knowledgeable scientist or a scientifically knowledgeable theologian or Bible expositor. It must be both. That is good creation science. Bad creation science is the absence of that. It's when you have a scientist who's just a Christian but is not particularly doctrinally literate, or when you have somebody who is doctrinally literate but doesn't know much about science. That is bad creation science. As to the age of the universe, this is a different subject, Tahu and Bahu. I believe the biosphere, the earth, the inhabited earth as we know it, is approximately 6,000 years old. I believe in the historicity of the book of Genesis based on what it says. What it was in Tahu and Bahu, void of form, the scripture does not tell us. One of the symptoms or hallmarks of bad creationism is the following. They misread it as a science book or as a book on the history of creation. Genesis 1 to 11 is not that. In fact, Proverbs 8, John's Gospel, both speak of the creation. The book of Revelation reverse engineers the creation, and the book of Job, particularly the closing chapters of Job, speaks more of the creation verse by verse than Genesis does. And Job tells us we don't know how God did these things, other than he spoke them into being. When people try to use Genesis or the Bible as a science book, they're heading for trouble. Now, this is not to say that there is not scientific material in the Bible that can be used apologetically to verify it. There is scientific material in the Bible, but it's not a science book. This goes beyond science. A brief diversion. I'll give you two examples of people who really messed up theologically because they read a Bible as something different than what it was in its genre and intent. One is Harold Camping, Family Radio. No theological background. He was an engineer. And of course, engineers are interested in mathematics or applied mathematics. They're not pure mathematicians, they're applied mathematicians. And what he did, he took his engineering training, which involves applying mathematics to building something or understanding how something is built, and he applied it more than once to prophecy. And he got into date settings. What was he doing? He was reading the Bible as if it were a math book. Now, the Bible has mathematical content, which has an apologetic value in verifying its credibility and its inspiration and so forth, but it's not a math book. Another is Tony Campola, a pathetic figure indeed. He said when King David sinned, God loved him because he sinned with gusto. Tony Campola is a twisted mind, and his son is worse. What did Tony Campola do? He began reading the Bible as if it were a sociology book. That's what misled him. That's how Satan tricked him. Because by his own education and training, he was a sociologist. Well, the Bible is the same. Genesis creation account and the creation accounts elsewhere in Scripture, such as Job, are not a science of the creation, and they are not a history of the creation. Genesis 1 to 11 is the theological interpretation of the history of the creation. It's just like the Gospels. John writes, if everything Jesus did, all the books that exist, at least the books that existed at that time, could not contain it. It was not a comprehensive history of Jesus. What the Gospel was is a narrative. And that narrative's purpose is, a narrative is a true story. Its purpose of the Gospels is the theological interpretation of the history of Jesus doctrinally. So Genesis 1 to 11, it's not the science or the history of the creation. It is the theological interpretation of the history. It is a narrative. In other words, it is a true story. When you try to make it into a history book and you read it as history, even though it has historicity, it's not written as a history book. The Gospels have historicity. In other words, the stuff actually happened, but it's not written for the purpose of giving us a history. It's given to us to interpret the history theologically. And it's the same with the creation and the same with the new creation in the Gospels. When you get that mixed up, you go off. You go off. Let me explain. I believe God created the world in 6 days, as defined in Genesis. Yom. Bible defines a day as or lahoshech, light to dark. Right now it's 24 hours and a bit. In Revelation, a day is going to be reduced from 24 hours to 16. A third of the night's going to disappear and a third of the day. You'll have a 16-hour day. When King Hezekiah was healed, the sun went back. Mathematicians reckon about 15 degrees. He was given another 15 years of life, okay? Because the day was longer than 24 hours. When Jesus died on the cross, the sun went down at noon, and it could not have been an eclipse because it was the 14th of Nisan. God supernaturally intervened with time. Kairos, Thomas, we think of it as a clock, depends on the second heaven. It depends on planetary movement, okay? And lunar movement, okay? When Joshua stopped the sun, the day was 48 hours. Well, how long is a day? Some places it's 16, some places it's 48, some places 20. It's not about that. It's about light to dark, or lahoshek. When people come in and they read into the text things it doesn't say eisegetically, based on their own assumptions. A day means 24 hours. Not in Revelation 16, not the day Jesus was crucified, not the day Joshua stopped the sun, not the day God made the sun go back in the days of Hezekiah. That is bad creation science. We can defend the historicity of what Genesis says. It is a narrative. It is a true story like the gospel. But it is a theological interpretation of the history. The story is the theological interpretation. I often tell the story, the personal experience as a boy growing up in New York, New Jersey. There were 2 books I read about the American Civil War. One was Bruce Catton's Pictorial History of the Civil War. Now, I don't mean it was a picture book. It had maps and period paintings and photos with the text. It wasn't an academic book, but it was a serious book. Not like Shelby Foote, but it was a good book for kids. Okay, if you were a pretty good reader, you could understand it. I read that book. That was a history book. But then I read a book by an author from Newark, New Jersey named Stephen Crane called The Red Badge of Courage. One gives you the history. Another gives you the story of somebody who's in the Battle of Shiloh. They're two different books about the same subject. You can write a true story, but it is not the history. It is about the experience and interpretation of the history. Well, the Bible is the same as other literature. Genesis is a true story. It is a narrative, just like the Gospels. But its purpose is not to be the history nor the science of the creation, even though it is historically true. And science bears out the absurdity of things like Darwinism and denial of the deluge, of the flood, and so on. Science supports there was a flood. Okay. Science bears it out. History bears it out. The myth of Gilgamesh. Other people, other civilizations of the ancient Near East knew the story of Noah. They knew something like that happened. And the people rescued on the ark. Now, of course, the scripture gave us the historically correct version of it, and the scripture gave us the theologically correct understanding and interpretation of it, but other civilizations knew it. It was a true story. It had historicity, but it was not written as the history. It was written as the theological interpretation of the history. We see this in the two main places, one being in Peter, where Peter refers to Noah and the flood, and also in the Olivet Discourse when Jesus refers to it. Okay? So get the genre right. When you see somebody taking the genre and taking what is a narrative and turning it into a history, they are misreading it. Read it for what it is. God inspired it to be written as the theological interpretation of the history. It is a true story, but it is not written to give you a comprehensive view of the history, nor the science. Much the same as the gospel. The gospel was not written primarily to give us the history of Jesus, even though it's historically true in what it says. It's to interpret the history of Jesus in bringing salvation and promising to come again. You have to read the genre that God gave it as. Bad creation science reads it as some other kind of genre. I hope that explains it.
Very good, Jacob. Thank you.